Thank you for joining today's session on Marketing Cloud Administration as part of our Marketing Cloud Subcontractor Onboarding Series. I'm Nikki Davies, Senior Learning Consultant with Salesforce University as a member of the User Adoption Services team. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, as always, I don't intend to make any forward-looking statements. Please make any purchasing and investment decisions based on currently released and public functionality. All right, let's talk about navigating through the administration first of all, because there are two places that we can access administration, because there are really two types of administrative roles that can be assigned. We're going to talk more about role assignment and how that works later on in this session, but let's go ahead and talk about where we can navigate through. So first of all, there is email administration, so specific to accessing the administration tab from within the email application. That is our legacy administration capabilities are all under there. We have built out the Marketing Cloud Administration, so you're going to find a lot of those same options available through the welcome dropdown if you have an admin role assigned. And the reason why we have those two things broken apart is, once again, the Marketing Cloud stemmed from the email product, which was formerly a company called ExactTarget that Salesforce bought in 2013. And the email marketing was the history, and it was the center of that platform. As we're evolving, it's starting to separate out, and you're going to notice that we're starting to duplicate some of the things that were in the email application alone have been moved out into other products. So just a good thing to keep a note there that this is one of those places we're going to see that happening. So some variances here. Let's go ahead and just jump in to the application here in just a moment. But the most important difference, or the most significant difference, is that under the email administration screen, we're going to see items that are specific to the email platform. And specifically, we're going to see reply mail management. We're also going to see send management, including our send classifications, our delivery profiles, and our sender profiles. We'll talk about those all in more depth during this session as well. Under the Marketing Cloud Administration screen, we're going to see installed packages from HubExchange. So, for example, our implementation with Marketing Cloud Connect that connects your Salesforce.com environment to the Marketing Cloud. Or the other installed package we have is Microsoft Dynamics for their CRM. Pardon me. It's also through there that we can manage FTP accounts and FTP users. We'll talk about that in more detail as well today. And then we can also manage tags that have been used across campaigns. We can also turn on email approvals management and campaign approvals management. We're not going to talk about approvals much today, but this is certainly the interface where we can turn those on in the Marketing Cloud. All right, so to show you where those live, if we go into the welcome dropdown into administration, pardon me. All right, so when we come into admin, what we're going to see is our account admin information here. I'm in the enterprise level account. And so you're going to notice that even if I go into the child account, we'll see other options. So under the account settings, we have the account settings, which is what we're looking at now. Users, FTP accounts, our business units, roles, tags, installed packages, and we see our Salesforce integration here. Under security, we have our login setting, our security settings, our login IP whitelist, validation log, and our export email whitelist. Under applications, we can see the approvals options, and those are all related to approvals and what we can turn on there. So there are two different approvals tools. There's approvals for email. There's campaign approvals. And then Approvals Classic is the legacy email approvals tool. Because this is a demo account, you are very unlikely to see all three things in this menu. All right, under data management, we have file locations, not to be confused with our FTP accounts, and we'll talk about that later. And we also have key management. So you're going to notice if we navigate into the email application now, And under that admin tab, that we have largely the same items here. If I expand data management, we're going to see that those are file locations and key management, but we have some additional items that we didn't have before. For example, we have reply mail management. Tracking configuration is it's something that could be enabled. It's not something that's typically used. If it is, it's added on as a customized piece. We won't be talking about that in today's session because it's not something in the duration of time I've been in an account I've ever seen used. All right, down below we have our send management. Now here you're going to see more send options than in a typical account, and that is because we have some things that are not consistent functionality, number one, but also we have the legacy SMS sender profiles here. Before we had Mobile Connect, our SMS product was built within the Marketing Cloud or within the email application. So we won't be talking about these. And then there are a few items through here, test send thresholds, subject pre-header validation, and URL expiration that are non-standard functionality. So we will not be talking about those items. I believe those are beta options. All right. So let's go ahead then and start talking about those items that we found under account settings. So in account settings, when we go in, we will see that there aren't a lot of edits that we can make here because most of these are controlled under the business unit when the account was configured. It's not that we can't change these, it's that we're not going to change them here. So for our current business unit, we'll be able to adjust things like, do we want alerts when we get product releases? That generally should be a yes, and those will send out to all of your users. We can manage the time zone for the business unit. So if you are sending from the likes of the email application, then your send time when you're scheduling will be based on this business unit's time. We can also set our date format, how we want to view things in that way. And then we can also update company information that if we are using the standard functionality to pull in our email footers with personalization strings, they will pull in from this business unit and populate at send time. We also have the ability to adjust our headers and footers on our template-based emails. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So if I go in here and I go into that account settings page, we can see if I click edit, do I want to hide all apps? If I turn that on, then I'm only going to see the apps I have access to in that app switcher. Receive product alerts on, that means I'm getting my release notes. Enable Social Studio. If you are a user of the social products with Radian6, then if you mark this to true, you can enter your logins and access the Social Studio products through there. If you don't, you can toggle this to false, and then they won't see anything under that drop down. Okay, so I'm going to keep that at true. Down below, this is where I was saying that we can't edit what we're seeing about the name of this account and the address and the base portfolio, but what we can adjust here is our time zone and our date format. We can also see how many business units we have, how many active users we have. And then under here, this is our company information. We can edit these fields. And then finally, here at the bottom, we have the ability to change from the system default headers and footers, both the HTML and the text, that if we're sending template-based emails, these will pull in on the wrapper of those. So we don't have to add them to our templates every time. Okay, so keeping in mind that federal CAN spam for commercial emails does require a link to unsubscribe and a physical address. So at least that's specific to the U.S. Different countries have different policies with regards to what is required. So that's where we need to be, most customers know what the requirements are in their respective countries, but we should always be telling them that they need to talk to their legal team to ensure that they are within compliance of the latest in regulation regarding their email laws. Yes. So, Castle, I know in Canada, is changing frequently, it seems. So, all right, but I digress. Let's go ahead and jump back then and talk about how we are going to configure those headers and footers and what those things mean. So we clearly had 3 different bullets that we saw. We saw system default, which is going to be the Salesforce Marketing Cloud logo, and you're going to see our address. That's not what your customers are going to want. They frequently want to know how to do this and where to do this. If they are using templates that already have their header and footer on them, or if they are pasting HTML into their emails, they probably want to use the none option, because if they're already including that information, you don't want to see double footers on your emails. If, however, they don't want to use Salesforce Marketing Cloud, but they do want something to go on the wrapper, and this is the system default one, then they can create a custom default. And when I say default, what I'm talking about is that these are going to be the ones that the system is going to generally apply unless we specify something different on a sender profile, okay, or a delivery profile, I should say. But in general, this is where people are coming more and more. I'm seeing the none option used because people are including these on their templates and their emails directly. All right, let's go ahead and talk about users. So when we are creating users, we're going to go under that account tab. We can do it from either interface, whether we're in the email application or whether we're in the Marketing Cloud. We can create users, we can disable users, reset their passwords, we can manage their access. There's also an ability to import users using a CSV file, and that sample file is available within the interface. So it's something you can definitely check into. So when we create a user, they do not have any permissions. We'll talk about that in the next step. But we also have to assign them their roles, which is how they get their permissions. And then we also have to assign their access to which business units. If we're in an enterprise account, they will have access to the business unit in which they are created by default. But if we want them to have access anywhere else, then we need to assign that. So let's go ahead and take a look at creating a user. So when I come in here, and so I have my users here under the email admin, or if we come here under the admin screen, we can get there from here. I tend to find that coming through the admin screen more often, I guess I shouldn't call it the admin screen, the Marketing Cloud administration screen, because it will drop me back to wherever I was when I'm done working. So notice, in this account, I have a maximum number of users has been reached. As long as I have users that have been, I have 5 licenses. So if I count down the status, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people are enabled currently. So that means that I can't create a new user yet. In order to free up that license, I've got to disable someone. So I'm going to go ahead and disable Greg, just for the purposes of demonstrating this. And now that I have Greg disabled, if I refresh my screen here, you'll notice my create button is now available. So if I click in on a user, so for example, on my own, this is going to be very similar to what we saw under the cloud preferences here, right? But as an admin, I can change anyone's password. I don't believe I can change anyone else's security questions. I would hope not. But if I look in on Greg's, for example, yeah, I can only change my own security questions. So in any event, let's go ahead and create a user. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create here. And when I do, I'm going to go ahead and create a user for, my colleague, Courtney. So I'm going to enter the reply email address. That's something that's a legacy functionality, but it's still required. You'll see that in drop downs for sending from names. And then I need her username. So let's just give her that username. All usernames must be unique across the entire platform. So if you go to save and it says it's not a unique username, it means that username is in use, not necessarily even within this enterprise account, but all the way across all Marketing Cloud accounts worldwide. All right, so what time zone is she in? I would go ahead and set that. Well, she's on Atlantic time because she's in Canada. Culture code, let's put her in English Canada, and you'll notice that if there were any changes to spelling, it would be like the like color would be O-U-R instead of O-R. She's not an API user. API user is a very important thing to know the impact of checking that box. It's managed under security settings. There's a tie-in there. But essentially, we can have our security settings say that an API user's password never expires, which would mean Courtney's password never expires, which would mean she never has to change her password, which would make this account less secure. So unless it's really for an integration, we really don't want our users to be API users. All right, I need to create Courtney a temporary password here. So our passwords by default must be a minimum of 8 characters with 1 capital, 1 lowercase, 1 number, and 1 special character. So I've got that. I'm just going to go ahead and hit save. All right, and we can see that information here. So you'll notice if I go back to my users tab that I don't have an ability to delete any users. And that's because our user history stays within the account. So what we don't want to do when we have a new user, and let's say Greg left, Courtney was his replacement, what I wouldn't want to have done was go in, instead of creating a new user for Courtney, put Courtney's information in place of Greg's, because then the system would show that Courtney had a user history in the application for anything that Greg did predating when she actually had access. So this is important for keeping a consistent legal record of access and use. So always assume that there's possibility for a disgruntled employee down the line, and that's a great reason to not share licenses, number one. That's also a very common question. Is the same thing. You can't tell who did what if we're using shared licenses, versus if each individual user has their own license, we can keep a very clean history of who did what in this account. Okay. All right, so if I want to then assign, so currently Courtney doesn't have, she only has access to this business unit. She does not have any roles, and those roles comprise our permissions. So we're going to end up working with Courtney a little bit more here shortly to assign her access. Okay, I'm actually going to go ahead and do that now so I don't forget. So essentially, when I jump in to managing roles, and we can talk about what these different roles mean. So business unit is any, so for any business unit she has access to, or just for this business unit, assuming I'm giving her access to different business units later, right? So I can go in here and go into edit roles and say she is an admin with Marketing Cloud Administrator access. And then she would have the same level of permission as what I do right now. And you'll see when we save that, all the permissions that she has across all of the packages in the Marketing Cloud. We have over 1,200 permissions, which is why, notice I could go in on the individual user and edit the permissions on the individual user, but I don't have visibility to that in an easy way to know what the difference is, unless I really want to read through all of these individual items. So that's why we always recommend using roles, and we'll talk more about roles later on. Okay. The other thing is if I want to give Courtney access to a business unit other than Tracy's, so I'm going to go click on Courtney's name, checkbox next to her name, and then it's manage business units here. So if I come in here, the default business unit, this is the business unit she's going to log in, drop into when she logs in. So I want her to come into the custom training business unit. And I actually don't want her to have access to Tracy's business unit, so I'm going to mark that into custom training. And I'm going to hit save. Now, if you recall, a moment ago, when I gave her access to roles, I only gave her access to the roles under Tracy's business unit. So when I took away her business unit access, I also took away her roles. So as it is right now, she could log in, but she wouldn't be able to navigate anywhere without getting error messages. So if you ever experienced that when you were first issued your username from a customer account, just email them and say, hey, I don't appear to have any roles assigned, and they'll go ahead and sort that out for you. All right, so now she is in the custom training business unit. She has these roles. If we go under any, what that's essentially saying is that if she gets assigned to another business unit without being assigned a role, she's not going to have any permissions by default. They're not going to carry. So most of the time I do see people assign the any role with the assumption that if they're only going to be working in one business unit, they don't care. Or if they're working in multiple business units, they need the same level of access across those. All right. So it's really kind of a threefold, almost like a braid, in terms of we've got to create our user, then we've got to assign access to a business unit, then we've got to assign permissions using a role. Okay, one other thing here to show under users, and that is if I click on import here, if you are in a brand new account, or if your customer is going to be in a new account and needs to, maybe they're setting up a new business unit and they don't want to manually create a bunch of users themselves, they can come in here and use the bulk user update. If you click here, it will download for you a sample user file that shows what needs to be on that file in order to import. So the important thing here is enabled is a true or a false value to enable that person. We have to make sure that we've met all of our other criteria here. But you'll notice what this does not have is it does not have business units. Also, just from personal experience, it shows role external keys here. I have found when I use role external keys that I've gotten errors on import. So typically, I will leave the role external keys off, and instead I will manually assign the roles in the business units. Okay. And that's it for user administration. So now let's go ahead and talk about those FTP accounts. So we have under the account dropdown, we see FTP accounts. This is an enhanced FTP user. A long time ago, when someone got their new Marketing Cloud account, they would send the person who signed the contract the login credentials for the FTP. Most of the time, that was an executive who was never going to use that FTP, and that email went missing. Huge problem. So what we've created now is once the FTP has been provisioned, sidebar on that, FTP is automatically provisioned at the enterprise business unit by default. If you're working with a customer who has just created a new business unit and they don't have an FTP yet, they just need to call support and have them provision one. There's not a cost to that, but if an FTP isn't something that just magically appears in your account. So just something to be aware of. But once they do have an FTP for their account, then they can come in through here and add that FTP user, which allows them to create their business unit user login and then set the password for that. So that way the business unit FTP user is going to be the one that automations are tied to. But if they need additional users to have access to the FTP and you don't want them to have the same master credentials, if you will, you can come in here and set up additional users. So if I go in here, And I'm going to switch into the custom training business unit because I don't want to mess up with poor Tracy's account. Important thing about the FTP, there is not an interface native to Marketing Cloud for accessing and working with the files on the FTP. We do recommend that you use an FTP client, such as FileZilla, in order to be able to do that. So here, if I go into FTP accounts, and you'll see over here it says add FTP user. So when it pops up here, there's my FTP username. All that FTP username is my MID for my business unit. So now I need to set my FTP password here. So you'll notice that I need it to be 12 characters. I need it to have one letter, one number, one special character, and then we'll be fine. So let me think of something. Let's say and then I've got to repeat that. And then hit save. And my passwords don't match. All right, so let me try that again. And now it's saying it's password complexity issue. All right, this is always the hardest part, guys. In any event, you get the idea. Once I have this done, so there we go. All right, so notice it says one or more activities is still running. Please refresh this page to update the status. All right, there we go. And notice it says the status is that it's pending the creation of this user. But I can see that this user was added, who added it, when, and here's the FTP URL. So I would use this URL in FileZilla using port 22 in order to access the FTP client. All right, so essentially what this is going to allow us to do is when we are working with automation, so import activities, file transfers, export activities, this is going to be what the system can use to the system can use the files that are on that FTP, but if I need to log into the FTP to download or upload a file, that is how I'm going to be able to do that. Also, error files, error messages are often put on the FTP and text form. So that's another reason why people commonly will access that FTP. All right, so we talked about business units earlier in terms of assignments, but what we're really talking about is an organizational structure for access and sharing information. So when we build a business unit, it's a very simple configuration. It doesn't take long to do. And in an enterprise account or a corporate account, we can create additional business units. However, this is where it's important to know whether you're dealing with a new customer or a legacy customer. Historically, Enterprise 2 customers, which are just enterprise customers, had the ability to create unlimited business units at no cost. After the Salesforce acquisition of ExactTarget, they decided, hey, we really should be charging based on how many you get. So now a corporate business unit or a corporate enterprise account comes with a fixed number of business units. They can buy additional, and an enterprise account may have an unlimited. So it's something that you want to be aware of when we're talking about creating business units in a training environment. More often than not, it's not about creation, it's talking about that structure and how they interact. All right, so when we're creating them, it's really filling out a form. The name, the business unit, the email information, the physical address that's going to pull in of that business unit if we were using that default footer. But then the unsubscribe settings. Those unsubscribe settings are probably the most important radio button in the entire email application. So what that unsubscribe setting does is it essentially tells us, hey, if someone unsubscribes from an email sent from this business unit, do we want to unsubscribe them from all of the business units in this account, in this enterprise, or only this one business unit? This depends on the way the account is configured. So also, this is why we do not send from the enterprise level account. Because if we send from NTO here and Johnny unsubscribes from NTO, then Johnny has also unsubscribed from the store and online for each of these regions as well. We've just lost access to him through multiple facets. However, if NTO is really just a way to segment out our brand, and we want to honor that opt-out all the way across, then we might set it to opt-out from enterprise, because if these are really just ways that we've defined our differences in our line of business and not really our communications, then it might make more sense to use unsubscribe from the enterprise only. So what goes into deciding when a new business unit could be created? Number one is, how is that subscription being managed? If we're using different subscriber keys and we are using, which is a unique identifier, we'll talk about that more when we talk about data management. But if all subscribers is being updated differently, if we are using different databases of records, if we have separate, so automations and journeys are created at the business unit level, so our reports and campaigns. So if we want to be able to see everything all in one, then we probably don't want to keep them in different business units. However, if we have users who they have very distinct assets and collateral and they don't want to work together, we very well may find ourselves working in different business units. If the data is drastically different between the business units, between the lines of business, then that's another primary reason why we will have different business units. We can still see the business units across the cloud calendar. I know we talked about that in a previous session. But the other thing is time zones. So if we are in any of our individual channels, when we schedule a send from the email application or from Mobile Connect or Mobile Push, and we're sending them directly within those channels, the send time is based on the business unit time. Well, if I have users who are talking to customers in America and users who are talking to customers in Spain, that's not going to be the same time zone. We could be hitting people while they're asleep in one of those regions. So we just want to be strategic and mindful of that. There are alternatives to it by using Automation Studio to schedule our sends instead, but it is something to be mindful of. All right, so when we create a business unit, and I can just come in here to business units, it's also through here. So I mentioned in account settings where we couldn't change our business unit's information. If we go under custom training now, you'll notice that this is this business unit. I can change this business unit's name. Here's the time zone, the date format. If we are setting up that hierarchy, I am saying that this business unit, Tracy's, is my parent. As we scroll down here, so business unit custom homepage. This is where if they are hosting a custom profile center hosted through the Marketing Cloud, previously it only showed the landing pages hosted within the email application, the precursor to cloud pages. You would see that here for selection. All right, you can see the email display name and reply address on the business unit by default. Down below, we have the company information, which has been inherited from that business unit, Tracy's business unit, so it's got the same information. If I deselect this, I can put whatever I want there. And then at the very bottom of the page, this is that most important radio button selection across the entire Marketing Cloud, which is, am I unsubscribing from everybody from the enterprise or only from this business unit? Okay, and once I'm done making changes, I'll just go ahead and hit save. So to create a business unit, it's really just a matter of filling out that form. Fairly simple. Now, you will also see here when we're on the business units page, we can see the name of the business unit. You can put a description in. We can see the parent name. Notice it doesn't say parent right here, and that's because this is an easy way to identify what the enterprise is if you're getting into a new account and you're not sure. It's a great way to tell. The number of users assigned in each business unit. Very important thing is that if you are deleting out a business unit, you cannot delete a business unit until you have disassociated all of the users assigned to that business unit. So I would have to go and view. So if I click here, I can view those users, can make a note, then go back in and remove their access, and then and only then can I delete that business unit. You might find yourself deleting business units if you are creating them in training because, as I said before, creation of a business unit does, if they go over their subscription, there's a cost value to it. Okay. Previously, if you aren't in an enterprise account, if you have a customer who has business units to spare and you're going to have people attending training who work in separate business units, it isn't outlandish to ask if it makes sense to the customer to create their own business unit and assign all of their attendees to a business unit for the purposes of training to contain all that collateral in one place. And then from there, we're also cutting off any so creating a training unit, a business unit for training is not uncommon. It's also because Marketing Cloud sandboxes are not typical. Many times we'll have a customer that just creates a business unit. They call it a sandbox, but it's actually a fully functioning business unit within their enterprise Marketing Cloud account, rather than paying for a separate sandbox that does not have the full functionality of a Marketing Cloud account. So if you see a sandbox business unit, it's pretty common to train within that, and that's definitely what we would recommend. Okay? All right. So let's talk about permissions and roles now, because we already saw how we can assign those roles and assign the business units, but we didn't really talk much about those roles and permissions themselves. So when we're talking about Marketing Cloud permissions, those are the most granular way that we can control access in the Marketing Cloud. And so they break down really by the feature or the application, the object within that application, and then the action that we can do with that. So I could be talking about in the email application whether or not I want to be able to send, right, or send preview, and I could see that within there. Okay, so we have over 1,200 permissions within this, and as the platform grows and we add functionality, the permission list expands. So we really don't want to set up permissions on the individual level for each user for that reason. It's really hard to manage that. So when we're looking at how the permissions are managed within the interface, there are two checkboxes. There's allow, there's deny, but we can have neither selected. So when we have allow, the user can see that button, they can work with that asset, they can do it. When we have deny, they cannot select the button. It may be grayed out, or it may not even be on their screen. But if neither is checked, they may be able to click the button and then they get an error message, or the button may be grayed out. Okay, so it just kind of varies from element of the application to another element of the application. So I've mentioned this, I think hopefully you've gotten this by now. We don't recommend managing them on the individual person because it's really hard to have visibility into who has access to what. All right, so it's also really inefficient for testing purposes. So rather than assign permissions to individual users, we recommend using our system-defined roles out of the box. And stemming from there, we're going to compile those together to then be able to achieve 90% of the time, we can use our system-defined roles just fine. But what we might find is that we've got to use a combination of them to give the right level of access. From there, what we will be able to do is create a custom role if we're still not meeting it, okay? So when we're talking about our system-defined roles, we have the Marketing Cloud Administrator, Marketing Cloud Channel Manager, Marketing Cloud Content Editor and Publisher, the Security Administration, and the Marketing Cloud Viewer. The least access here is the Marketing Cloud Viewer. All of these pertain to applications other than the email application. And that's because the email came first. It's got its own set of access. So if you have users who are only working with the likes of Mobile Connect, Mobile Push, these are all the sets that they need. You won't have to touch the email application permissions for them. However, if you have people who are going to be working across the cloud and need access to the entire system, then we very well may find that we need to assign some combination of things. Now, common combinations I see is Marketing Cloud Channel Manager and Marketing Cloud Content Editor Publisher. So Channel Manager is going to allow us to do things like automations and work with campaigns, but Content Editor Publisher is going to allow us to create the messages in Content Builder and in Marketing Cloud or in Mobile Connect and Mobile Push. So if we tie these two things together, our roles only have allow permissions checked, except for Viewer, which has deny permissions. So do not put an MC Viewer with an admin or you will cut off your own arm. Okay? So we always want to make sure we have a Marketing Cloud role for our customers if they're going to be anywhere outside the email application. So generally, Marketing Cloud Channel Manager and Content Editor Publisher in combination with whatever email application roles they need. So we have 4 application roles for the email application. So we have Administrator, which they can work with the content, they can work with the data, they can work with the same actions that we can use in Automation Studio that are housed under the Interactions tab. They can view their tracking. They have access to admin. And then in the legacy email application, they have access to those shared folders. Content Creator will allow them to access Content Builder from within the email application if they have that Marketing Cloud Channel or Marketing Cloud Content Editor Publisher role. But if not, under Classic Content, they can access the content, they can view the tracking, they can access their shared folders. They have Data Manager. They're able to work with the data, the automation pieces. They can view their tracking, and then any data that is housed in shared folders. And then an analyst will only have access to the tracking information in there. So it's really common to apply, let's say, Marketing Cloud Channel Manager, Marketing Cloud Content Editor Publisher with Content Creator and Data Manager and Analyst for someone who's going to be working robustly across the email application and working with campaigns and automations. And for training, that is what I recommend that you have the users have for when you're working with them, just to prevent and allow for more efficient experience during the training process to ensure that your users aren't having permissions errors the entire time. Even if the customer then goes back after training and adjusts those roles and permissions to be specific to their long-term needs, but for training purposes, I do recommend having those 5. So Channel Manager, Content Editor Publisher, having the Content Creator, Data Manager, and Analyst. All right, so let's talk about signing roles. We already saw this in the application. So the users do not have those roles by default. So once a user has been created, we're going to check that checkbox next to their name, and then we will either, if we want to select what business unit they need to have those roles for, then we can go ahead and select the business unit and then assign the roles. If it doesn't matter, we can leave it at any and just go straight into assigning those roles. Okay, So when our system-defined roles do not meet those user requirements, that's where we can create those custom roles. So as you're creating those custom roles, we need to understand that we operate by the principle of least privilege. So a deny will always override an allow. So it allows us to mitigate risk that way. So we always want to make sure we're providing our users with the minimum amount of access that they need to complete their work. So we'll adjust that allow or deny using custom roles that we can then pile on top of our out-of-the-box roles. So when we're creating custom roles, 5 questions we should always ask. First of all, the feature or the application being used. Does the user currently have access to the required feature or application? If they have access, what can the user currently access that needs to be restricted? And from what is the user currently restricted that they need to have accessible? And then finally, the actions. What does the user need to be able to do that he or she currently cannot do? And what can the user currently do that needs to be restricted? So some examples of that would be, hey, if they have access to Mobile Connect and we want them to be able to send messages, but we don't want them to be able to manage the data, then we would go into deny and under creating lists within Mobile Connect. Okay? All right. So tips for creating custom roles, I mentioned before, is identifying those steps. So then we want to name our roles right in alignment with that, so that way we have a clear understanding of what that role does. So when we see it in the list of the standard roles, we know exactly what it's giving access to or taking access away from. So application object being affected, and then the access change. There's no limit to the number of custom roles, but it makes a lot of sense to pile them on so we have quick visibility. It also makes it much easier to test. So generally with testing, we want to assign to another user, have them log in, check, see what they can do, exactly what they need, nothing more, nothing less, to verify that the role is correct. All right, so we talked about assigning users to roles, so we're going to assign them to their business unit, assign them to the role, and then we can I've got something out of order here. All right, well, I'll be changing this slide. We should be creating our business unit, creating our role, creating our user, and assigning the business unit and the role to that user. But you do need to email that user their login credentials. Okay? All right. So the installed packages tab in here, which if we come under, here we go. So this has changed. We've got installed packages has been broken out from the Salesforce integration. So we can see here we have the AmpScript editor, and that is something that we can download. So what we're going to see under all packages are going to be items that we have downloaded from HubExchange. They've broken that out from the Salesforce integration here. So Salesforce integration, we can see our setup of our configuration there. But in any event, when it comes to managing those installed packages, if we want to provide individual users, it used to be for Mobile Push and for Journey Builder. If we want individual users to have access to including mobile messages within their journeys. And so I don't think I have that in this account because I don't think we have mobile access. But where this comes into play is primarily with Journey Builder. If they want to have a multi-channel journey, yeah, we don't see it here. So it would, if they have Mobile Connect or Mobile Push enabled, we will see those listed just as we see on the screenshot of Journey Builder Mobile Push, Journey Builder Mobile Connect. And it's through here where we can give access to the individual users who are permitted to include mobile messages in a journey. The reason why that is licensed at an individual user basis is that when it comes to super message pricing, a mobile super message costs more than an email super message. The value actually varies from country to country. So check with your local sales teams to see, what that value is. I know in the U.S. it's one email is one email. One mobile message is 10 emails when it comes to super messaging. So if we have a miscalculation of how many mobile messages we could be sending in a journey, we could really blow through our subscription. So that's why that's locked down. All right, reply mail management. You send an email. They have their out of office on. Reply mail management dictates how to deal with those replies to our corporate messages. So essentially, we're going to send that email to our subscribers. We're going to get our all subscribes, or our auto replies, or our unsubscribes, or any other message that someone replies from something we sent. With an auto reply or an unsubscribe, we have settings that we can control to be able to say, hey, I'm going to unsubscribe that person from all subscribers. I'm going to just go ahead and delete all of those auto replies that were received. But I can also say, all right, if it's not one of those two, let's put up a forwarding address to allow that to be sent elsewhere. Now, I can't show you configured reply mail management. This is part of our sender authenticated package that most of our enterprise customers do have set up. But I can walk you through the form. But essentially, this is set up as part of the services implementation. When we are setting up reply mail management, you're going to see that we have the display name that's going to be on that reply, the subdomain that it would send those replies to. You can see we have DNS record redirect complete. The customer has to do that to be able to prove that the domain is their own. And then finally, it's also through this where they get to use their @salesforce.com instead of @marketingcloud.com that we're going to give them, right? So that way they can use their, @acme.com, whatever it is, that there is the same as their website. So they have to prove that they own the domain, and that's what that DNS record redirect is. From there, we can just specify, are we deleting our auto replies and our out of office messages and our unsubscribe requests, and then the terms that could be in those messages that we will honor. Currently, we only honor English terminology. The frequent asked question, to my knowledge, that is not something that's on the roadmap. I don't know if there will be down the line, but currently those words are available for selection to honor as unsubscribe requests. Okay, and then we also have the ability to forward an email to those who reply with messages other than an auto response. So as we go through reply mail management configuration, frequently people will have trouble because they don't have the right subdomain, or their routing address for the remaining replies are exactly the same as what the reply email address was. The other is the routing address has to be a real address in order to send those messages onward. So most of the time a support inbox gets those, or for storage or for review.
All right, let's continue with security management as part of our administration. So when we're talking about security settings, we're going to see one long form that when we hit edit, we're going to have a lot of options. And a couple of these are actually going to pertain to settings that appear elsewhere. So some common recommended settings are to increase the timeout session. Typically, this is the very first thing I'll do if I'm in a brand new account. And the reason for that is the default timeout is every 20 minutes. So every 20 minutes, you're going to be asked, would you like to end the session? You haven't been active in a while. It gets really annoying. So typically, we will set that 8 hours, I believe, is the maximum. Most people set it around between 2 and 4, depending in their environment. Enhancing password policies. So the default, like I said before, is 8 characters, letters, numbers, special characters required. But you can increase that, as you can see from the different drop downs there. Enforce export email whitelist. So we'll see this when we get into other places in the application. But for example, I could be looking at a table containing subscriber data, and there's an export button. I can select export, download that to my browser window by default. That's a security risk for most customers. So this is one that doesn't get used frequently enough, and I don't think enough people realize the safeguard is there. So when we click enforce export email whitelist, that corresponds to where we can add names to the whitelist. So only those on the whitelist can download that data. If we select enforce export email whitelist and we don't add any names to that whitelist, then we prevent anyone from being able to export, to anywhere other than the FTP. And then finally, we have log violations to the IP whitelist. So we have an IP whitelist, and we also have an export email whitelist. The export email whitelist is just who can export and email it to themselves or download it to a browser window. The log violations to IP whitelist, the IP whitelist is who can log into the marketing cloud from only specific IPs. So for logging violations, then that will allow us to, we have different settings that we can set with regard to that. So we'll take a look at that in more detail. So as we look at that login IP whitelist and the validation log, if we say log the violations, we still allow people to log into the marketing cloud who aren't on a specified list of IPs. But what it does do is give us their IPs, and we can see when they've requested an activation code and when that activation code was used. So if we want to create an IP whitelist, this is a great way to curate that without involving our IT department from our users. If we put in these specific ranges of IPs, then only those users who are on those IPs at that point in time will be able to access. So it's a way to lock down access, for example, when somebody's on the network. Okay. Different customers in different markets tend to have different policies. A lot of retail doesn't use an IP whitelist. Most of financial services and insurance and medical will use an IP whitelist. It's just things I've seen as a trend by and large. Okay, that export email whitelist I was talking about. So on the security settings page, and we're going to take a look at all 3 of these in just a moment, but when we check that box on the security settings page to enforce the export email whitelist, this is what it's looking at. So we create export email whitelist, and then we put on the usernames and the domains of the specific users who can export to their email inbox or to their browser window. Okay, specifically where we see that is anywhere there under our subscribers tab where we have our data stored. We also see it if we're under tracking when we go into the individual subscriber views, then we can download there. But if we have this enabled and we don't have anyone, then that takes away the access for everyone. You can always export to the FTP, which is what is a best practice because an FTP is certainly much more secure. All right, let's go ahead and hop into the account then. So if I go into security settings, and I click edit here, now I'm in the enterprise account. I will see the settings as well under the business unit. There are some of these that at the enterprise account, I can set these at the enterprise or I can define them at the individual business unit. So session timeout on this account is 8 hours. It's because it's a learning account. Require a secure connection, enable clickjacking. Login expires after. I can be not logged in for any amount of time and it's not going to expire on me. Invalid logins before logout. This is if I get my password wrong 3 times, it's going to lock me out of this account and I have to get someone who's an admin to come unlock me. All right. Count invalid logins across sessions. So in other words, if I try now and I try again in 2 days, it's still going to count that. Minimum username length, 4, 6, 8, or 10 characters. Allow users to grant account login access for support. This is where if you're calling Marketing Cloud support, the individual user can say, hey, they can access the account, or only top level account users can grant access to their individual account. So set by an administrator of whether or not we can have support impersonate in. All right, restrict logins by IP whitelisting. This is where, as I mentioned before, our IP whitelist on that second slide a moment ago. So IP whitelisting disabled, we don't care where you're logging in from. Log the whitelist violations. This is going to, from this point forward, once I hit save, give me a record of what IP someone has logged in from, what their username is, did they request an access code, did they use the access code. And the next piece here about IP whitelisting is the list source. Do I want that to be defined at the business unit level for the IP list, or do I want one at the enterprise level? Based on the different businesses, it may make more sense to define that at the business unit level. Allow machines not on the IP whitelist addresses to access. And you'll notice anywhere we have those questions, we can go ahead and click in here normally and get some more information. All right, so below that we have identity validation. We cannot turn that off. And then on where we have our business unit identity validation, that's essentially saying, are we going to do that when we log into different business units or the enterprise? Activation code, that's the email that you get with the activation code. How long is that going to be good for? And then we have time a device can be inactive before requiring activation. So in other words, how long has the IP that you've been logging into your account not logged into your account before you get the notification or that says, hey, you need to activate your device? Right now it's 3 months. All right. When a machine comes from within the whitelist, we don't need that validation. We can check that checkbox, but we're not using the whitelist up here because I don't really want to change Tracy's settings here. All right, second thing is password policies. These are pretty straightforward here. The important one is exclude API users from password expiration. As long as this check mark is there, that if you're marked as an API user, your password doesn't expire. We have the same ability with FTP users. Send password change confirmation email. If people don't want to receive that or you don't want your users to receive that, you can deselect that. All right, down below, the enforce export email whitelist setting. Once again, if we check this, it prohibits the download of data to the desktop or emailing it to the inbox. And we could define this either across the entire enterprise or at the individual business unit. And then it's up to the individual business unit admin to go under the security settings in that business unit and define what that whitelist is going to be. All right. And that's pretty much it for the security settings. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And so next, we want to take a look at just simply that login IP whitelist. And it's very simple. If I hit create, I'm putting in the starting range, the ending range. I can put in a description, and then I can specify, is this a user interface, a mobile application, or an API? And that login source really serves as a label. All right, next is the ID validation activity log. So if I'm logging those violations, this is where I can see the IP addresses that those we're using. And then finally, the export email whitelist. So little thing about that is if you want to whitelist an entire let's say everyone who's at the same company, you could do, at acme.com, and everyone who works for Acme who's a user of the system can then do that. If not, you have to do it with username and the domain according to the email address of the user within the Marketing Cloud application will have access to do that. Hit cancel. And that's for our that's all for security settings. Let's talk about data management then. So first we're going to talk about file locations. When we first came in, we talked about the FTP account user to be able to log into the file location. That referred to the Marketing Cloud Enhanced FTP. That is provisioned at the enterprise level along with your account, but it's not the only FTP that the Marketing Cloud can see. You can add additional file transfer locations. So if we go under here, we can create different locations based on where your company is pointing to. So to do this, what we're going to do is go so we've added data management here. It lives under the email application as well. And under file locations, and you can see in this account we have several different ones. If I hit create here, we can name that file location and specify the type of location. So if I want an SFTP, for example, then I'm going to use my FTP login credentials. These are going to store in the system. And then when we're doing imports, we can do an import from the customer's FTP directly into the Marketing Cloud. So this is a critical piece for customers that are not using, let's say, the Marketing Cloud or the Salesforce CRM and the Marketing Cloud Connect to move their data across. This is a critical piece for a large portion of Marketing Cloud customers who they have their own database, their own system repository for them to put their files on here and then use an automation to bring their files in on a recurring basis. And we could talk more about automation when we get into the Automation Studio piece. All right, but the Enhanced FTP, this is the one that is provisioned with your account. It is an SFTP, and when you are logging in through something like FileZilla to be able to upload or download files to your Enhanced FTP account, if you go into the documentation, it will give you specifically the directions for all of this, but essentially what you're going to end up putting into FileZilla is the URL, the file location, and then your MID and your password to be able to point to that, and using port 22. And once again, I would be remiss if I didn't say, when you create child business units, you must call support to have those FTPs provisioned. All right. We're in the home stretch now. So with administration, we're going to talk about send management. Now, send management pertains to, on the sending form, when we are doing a send, you're going to see send classification. And if you adjust that drop down, then there's two other drop downs that adjust accordingly. So the send classification really has three parts: a sender profile, a delivery profile, and then when we define the delivery profile, part of that definition on that screen is our CAN-SPAM priority. Why CAN-SPAM and not other countries? Because once again, this application started in the US, so it abides by default by US law. So essentially, when it comes to that CAN-SPAM priority, we're looking at classifications of either commercial send or transactional send. So when we have a commercial send, then we can deliver any kind of content we were selling. We are trying to get someone to purchase or have a business interaction with us. CAN-SPAM law requires a physical address and a link to opt out, some kind of opt-out mechanism. And the way the Marketing Cloud works is all subscribers are master table of sending. At send time, we'll evaluate its record for anyone who's opted out and automatically suppress anyone who's opted out from our commercial sends. Transactional, on the other hand, you are allowed to communicate without opt-in about a business relationship, about transactions that are currently taking place with your customer. If I buy something from you, I want my receipt. I don't necessarily want your newsletter. So, with that in mind, typically, and there's a lot of debate, and I'm not a legal expert, so this is where if someone is not sure about what's okay to have as transactional and what's okay to have as commercial, they should consult their legal teams. But with transactional, it's considered appropriate to have less commercial content or a very minimal amount of commercial content in transactional messages. And that does range from country to country. There are some countries where you are not allowed to have any commercial promotional information in a transactional message. But we don't require an opt out mechanism and we don't require a physical address. Also, when you create a send classification that is transactional, there's a checkbox to say whether or not you want to recognize the opt out and not allow those who are opted out to receive those emails. Now, that isn't the default, but you will see that checkbox on the send classification form. So, one quick thing about how I go about teaching send management is we talk about send classifications first, then we talk about the two underlying parts, the sender profile, the delivery profile, and then I typically jump into the application and show all three. The reason for that is that when we build our send classification, it asks us to map the send profile and the delivery profile for that classification. So it's kind of interdependent. So I go through all three pieces of content and then I will circle back, just as a note to instructors. All right, so as we talk about our sender and delivery profile, so our sender profile gives us the ability to use a different from name than what we saw under that business unit by default. So that means that we can say that this is, a from name specific to this type of communication. We always want it to say, for example, internally here at Salesforce, we have employee success. But we also have, I'm in the Indianapolis office, we also have from names that say the Indy Site Council. To distinguish, yes, it's all coming from the same org, but they're different types of communications, different relevance. Okay, and along with that goes the from email address. So it's a way to create relevance in the inbox and give a cue to your recipient exactly who's sending and why. Along with that, we have the ability to do the custom reply mail management. Now, when we talked about reply mail management earlier, we talked about the account default. But if we define this on the sender profile, we're saying, hey, anytime the sender profile is used, we want to deal with any replies outside of the traditional unsubscribe or out of office a little bit differently than just simply forwarding them onto that inbox. So let's say that you've got a sender profile that is from the CEO and CEO at yourcompanyname.com. If it appears that the CEO is sending this, and maybe he's sending it in response to a recall for a product, those replies for customers who think that they're emailing the CEO probably need to be treated in a very special way. And we can do that with that custom reply mail management. Okay. Along with that, we also have the delivery profile. So if as part of that sender authenticated package that allows for customers who've purchased that to use their own domain, and they can also have their own IP, meaning they're not sharing with anyone else. The sender reputation is entirely their own. If they have multiple IPs purchased and provisioned for an account, they can select which one those particular sends are going with. They can also specify a header and footer for those sends that's going to wrap around the template of their email separate from the one that we saw under account settings. Okay, so we'll assign both of these two things to a send classification. So when we come in here, and remember, send classifications on send management only lives in the email application because it's specific to the email application. So if I come in here under admin, and if I close these over here in the sidebar, I see my send classifications here. Remember, I want to go to sender profile, delivery profile first. So if I go under sender profile, and I'm going to actually switch business units. Tracy's has a lot of these. All right, so now let's go ahead and go into our admin here. And if I go into sender profile and I hit create, and I'm going to say this is UAS custom training as the name. The name is important because when we're looking at a send form, all we see about that classification is right here. So it is best to indicate the kind of classification we're working with. All right, down below, I can either choose a sender from the list, or more commonly, I can instead specify the information here. So user adoption services, Salesforce University. Now the interesting thing is the email address here does not have to be a real email address. So I could say inquiries at, now I should have the same domain and subdomain here that matches on my reply mail management. It's not essential, but it is best practice. And then I'm just going to hit save. Okay, so I'm going to go under the delivery profile and I'm going to hit create. And when I come under the delivery profile, this is where I would name this. Notice I don't have any IPs provisioned. I'm on a shared IP, so I can't set that. But under header, I could specify whether or not to use none, the account default, which would have been what was set under the account settings, or library content. Now you'll notice library content is going to not the content builder content, but classic content. So this is one of those places where we don't have parity yet. So I'm actually going to leave that as none, and I'm going to say UAS custom training and commercial, so I know which one it goes with, and hit save. And now I'm ready to create my send classification. And then down below, so here's where I set the CAN spam classification. So by default, it's set to commercial. If I switch that to transactional, of course, I'm not going to make this transactional. This checkbox here is the one I was telling you about where you can specify that it should honor those opt-outs on all subscribers and suppress anyone who's opted out of our communications. I'm going to leave that at commercial. And then I'm going to pick my sender profile and my delivery profile, and then send priority. Normal is fine, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And then on a send form, this is going to be available, and what I'm going to see is just this right here. Thank you for your time and attention today.